Kalispera σας. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. The event tonight is the Dimitris Tsiolkas Memorial Lecture, and I'd like to acknowledge the sponsor who is dedicated to the memory of Charalambos Maria as Prof. This initiative commenced 5 years ago when Kathy Alexopoulos and Eleni Nikas approached the Greek community of Melbourne about incorporating such a lecture in the seminar series. So it's a commemorative event. So this commemorative event is jointly hosted with the Greek Australian Cultural League. The poet Dimitris Tsiolkas, for those not familiar with him, was born on the, at the time, Italian-occupied island of Leros, and he had already 2 published poetry collections in Greece before departing for Australia in 1952. But it was in Australia where he blossomed. Among the prizes he received for his writing are the National Book Council Award in 1983, the Patrick White Award in 1994, and an Emeritus Award from the Literary Board of Australia Council for outstanding and lifelong contribution to Australian literature in 2002. In honouring Dimitris Tsiolkas, we invite a speaker to elaborate on the theme pertaining to Greek Australian or diasporic literature. This year, it's Professor Nikos Papastergiadis from the School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne. I don't think Nico needs introduction to anyone. He's been a frequent contributor to the seminar series and should be well known to most of you. His topic tonight, Facing the Fall, Humanism After Nihilism in Christos Tsiolkas' writing, sounds like a thought-provoking one. Where does one start with Tsiolkas' novels? He toys with many ideas. You can feel the anguish in his writing, the intellectual tension. Tsiolkas has described himself as an apostate to both Christianity and Marxism. Faith in the certitudes of religion or political ideology often acts as an anchor to humanity's challenges. It acts as a base from which one can plan humanity's amelioration. But what happens when this loss of faith occurs and drift towards nihilism, as in some of Tsiolkas' works? Does it open the door to humanity, or does it sow the seeds for the re-emergence of humanity? These are some of the ideas Nico will explore tonight, while contrasting them with the philosophical thoughts of Peter Sloterdijk, a German philosopher and cultural theorist, and Slavoj Žižek, a Slovenian-born political philosopher and cultural critic. Nico, it's great to have you back again. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you very much to Costa for all the support, the technical support to get this event happening. And once again, I'd like to extend all my thanks to the sponsors for this and many other seminars, which are all illuminating, and also pay my respects to the Indigenous forebears and custodians of this land upon which we have the privilege to be on. Facing the fall, what a question about nihilism, and what a week we've been having to reflect about this. If you're wondering what this lecture is going to be about, just reflect for a minute about what's been happening on our street and what's been going on Twitter. The protests in Melbourne, the so-called freedom marches or the death walks, are expressions of what? The right to defy life, the right to be against vaccines. But the vaccine is, like all good paradoxes, a life-affirming principle. It's a beautiful metaphor for the capacity for the body to fortify itself by incorporating the element of risk. Our leaders have failed to explain the obvious, and in failing to gain universal consensus towards the path that they want us to go, we've seen an emergence of conflict. Out of their failure, there's been conflict on the street. And when there's been conflict on the street, what has been the response? Smearing, rebuking, and even more threats to the mob. And what does that produce? Even more anger on the streets. So at the local level, all these reactions that we witnessed in the last week have been counterproductive. And at the so-called national level, a big fat void. Where is our great fence sitter from Canberra? Nowhere to be seen, as usual. Yet the result of this failure of political leadership is a gain in momentum towards the abyss. What these protests have shown is a rudderless descent, a cause without a narrative, leadership without leaders, ideological destinations which have no goal. It's all about anger and the egocentric insistence on the right to be angry, a right to have the right to be unbounded to the rights of others. Let me now say a few words about the man Dimitris Tsiolkas, in whose honor we have these lectures today. I first met Dimitri in 1984. It was a summer evening, and it was somewhere in Northcote. It was an amphitheatre, and he was doing a poetry reading. There was a significant crowd there, and I was sitting with the legendary writer and artist, George Michilakakis. After his performance, Dimitri came straight up the steps and came to George, and with a kind of laser-like intensity, asked him for a sincere and honest appraisal. George and Dimitri were very opposite in character and in political disposition, but there was obviously a deep mutual respect, a recognition that out of austere words comes not just the truth, but a kind of uplifting hope. In that year, I went on to meet Dimitri many times. I would visit him often in his house in Elwood. A few years later, he came and stayed with me in Cambridge. I was living in a shared household at the time. He was dreadfully fearful of catching psixi, aptorevma, and also very, very interested in all the young ladies of the house. After dinner, he enchanted them with his poetry readings and dedications. I'll never forget that on one occasion, returning back to Cambridge on a train trip to London, he had nothing else to do, and so he borrowed one of my books, a book of poetry by Pio, and started reading them. I thought, this is interesting. I thought he and Pio were enemies. To my surprise, Dimitri, as he was reading them, burst and cackled with laughter, and he exclaimed, "Don kerata, πώς τα βρήκε αυτά?" Recently, I read a manuscript by another dear friend called Paul Carter. It's a book that he's just written on migrant poetics and what he calls decolonial creativity. In this book, he quotes from Dimitris Tsiolkas' poems, the Book of Epigrams, and also from a beautiful essay that Dimitri once wrote for a magazine called The Island, and the essay was called The Distant Observer. Dimitri was a complex figure in the Australian literary circles. Some people seem to embrace him. His success, as Nick has already indicated, was meteoric. And that this success also coincided with the high point of multiculturalism and a kind of literary and cultural awakening that was happening in Australia. However, there were other parts of the Australian literary world that remained intransigent. Les Murray, for instance, acted as if Dimitris Tsiolkas never existed. He never included him in his edited anthologies, and this really hurt Dimitri. But as Paul Carter, an even greater scholar and a far more interesting thinker than Les Murray, said that there is always a very telling and important ambivalence in Dimitri's work. His homeward gaze is both near and far. It comes close, but then recoils. And I recall also the feeling that Dimitri often conveyed of aloofness towards activists, and also repulsion towards the so-called nostalgists in the migrant community. But he had this strange and unyielding affinity, not just with other poets in distant places and different cultures, but also with the kinds of ordinary people with whom he shared little adventures in the St Kilda boarding houses. In my memory, Dimitri's favorite word, evaluating other people's characters, but mostly for other poems and for his own work, was the word lito. It's what I remembered most deeply and what I think I've learned from Dimitri. So I want to acknowledge that briefly. Okay, let me get on to the main event and talk about Christos Tsiolkas' work. I'm going to give a lecture which will be in 6 parts. In this first introductory part, let me just give an indication of the range of forms and the function that we can discover from Christos' work. As most of you will know, that Christos is an enormously successful, internationally best-selling novelist. He's also a playwright, a author of lots of very interesting non-fiction essays, a very, very talented film critic, very astute eye, and of course, a radio presenter on 3RRR. Quite a Renaissance man in any sense. But one of the most interesting things about Tsiolkas' writing is the way in which it can provide a kind of indicator of broader political and social and cultural changes. Now, art and culture is never an accurate, but it's a useful indicator of the kinds of changes we see in the world around us. And so I think if we zoom into Tsiolkas' work, we get a very good, interesting portrait of the anxieties, the tensions, the issues that are ranged around Australian multiculturalism and globalizing society. And we can get to see some of the complications and a new trajectory for the way in which these issues are unfolding in our everyday lives. So I'm going to look at these novels as works of art, obviously, but also see them as a prism, a little microcosm for a bigger world that's happening around it. I think, in a sense, these novels by Tsiolkas reflect the conflict and tensions between a political ideology on the one hand and the public imaginary, people's everyday lives and the kind of discourses and policies that we have used to try to make sense of our lives. That conflict, I think, is borne out in the novels themselves. But I also think that there's an interesting development, or even a regress, you might say. Definitely a perduring set of themes that can be found across Tsiolkas' work. So, after that very brief introduction, let me go on to part 2, which is a brief survey of some of the novels by Tsiolkas. Tsiolkas' first novel, Loaded, was a sort of breakout novel. It catapulted him to fame immediately, but it was also a breakout novel in terms of its content and form, because the central character, Adi, is forever fighting against the repressive boundaries of the ethnic community, the Greek community from which he comes from, and also expressing profound and hostile resentment against the racist boundaries of the mainstream society. So the community feels too small, and the outside community feels too structured in a negative kind of way. So there's this constant flight and fight that's going on in that novel. That theme of flight goes in a very different direction in the next novel. If the first novel is all about conflict and opposition, the second novel, The Jesus Man, is a kind of descent, a sort of embrace with nihilism, but a sort of falling into the boredom of suburban life. Here, metropolitan culture is not a solution to or an aspiration for a migrant, but it is sort of the listlessness, the lethargy, the fatigue sense of hopelessness that exists in suburbia, which is the main theme of that novel. So that drifting stage is a sort of kind of feeling that what is like when there is no struggle. The third novel, Dead Europe, takes us on a different stage. It's sort of built on the premise that hope can be elsewhere. This is a very Australian fantasy, that Europe is a source of aspiration, is a site for aspiration, for development, for cultural renewal and expansion. And so the journey, it follows a young Greek Australian photographer who's seeking to make it in Europe, so to speak. And in Europe, this photographer experiences the two edges of the cultural spectrum. Europe is Janus-faced. On the one hand, it represents the Enlightenment vision of equality, rationality. On the other hand, Europe represents dark, chthonic beliefs in a spirit world. These two faces of Europe are in constant conflict. They're antithetical, but they're coexistent. And Tsiolkas explores this tension through the genre of the zombie novel. Now, ultimately, the figure, Isaac, this Greek-Australian photographer, does not find reconciliation. It's a very prophetic book in many ways. It predicts many of the sort of tensions that we now are all too visible in Europe. But he sort of finds Europe both bankrupt and provincial rather than open and progressive. And so there's no resolution for him, no redemption in Europe. And coming home becomes a kind of retreat rather than success story. The fourth novel, The Slab, is a kind of attempt to awaken the middle class, the lower middle class in particular in Australia, from their domestic complacency. I mean, the word woke would not have been valid at the time the novel was written, but in a way it's pricking the bubble and the delusions of the woke culture. It's a very interesting and subtle polymorphic and seeing things from lots of different angles, but ultimately it's trying to unpick this smugness and assuredness of the values that hold up so-called polite society in Australia. The final novel that I want to talk about is Barracuda. Barracuda also confronts this profound question of how class and culture can hold people together. What are the bonds that keep people aggregated? And what happens when those bonds break apart, when they disaggregate? So in that novel, Dan, this boy of mixed heritage, Greek mother, Australian father, is conscious of these class and race divisions, but he has the body of a superstar. He's a champion swimmer. And through his body, he thinks he can overcome everything. Now, ultimately, his body fails to deliver on his own agenda. And then there is again another story of descent and collapse and fragmentation into fragile, small spheres. Now, in this third part of the lecture, I want to now shift to a different kind of focus. I want to think about how we can zoom out and consider some of these themes that have been developed in Tsiolkas's novels, and think about how they also exist on a wider scale. Now, in some levels, through Tsiolkas's novels, we can see the great ideological divides that have been occurring right across the world, certainly the Western world. What Tsiolkas is basically charting and mapping is not just the divisions, the collapse of the divisions between progressive and conservative, but also the deflation of the power of both positions. The old certitudes that held the Liberal and Labour Party seem to have lost their footings. And in particular, what also seems to be the case is that this new agenda, this new political ideology, this new rhetoric, this new hope, in a sense, for Australia, this idea of Australia as a multicultural country, also starts to lose its foundations, and certainly seems to lose the energy and driving force for delivering a new kind of society. And so in Tsiolkas's work, we start to see how tensions that have come from globalization, the challenges that have been presented towards national identity, the very ways in which we understand our cultural and identity politics have all become exhausted and weakened and fragmented, and to some extent become reduced to rather banal platitudes. Now, this is sort of a sad and emptying out of the political rhetoric of our lives. And it's a sort of recognition that the rhetoric is becoming further and further away from our actual reality, the way in which our bodies and experience of community and our sense of connection to other people is actually operating. And that disconnect has profound consequences and real challenges. And there are profound risks that come when people don't have a language or a sense of connection to those around, not just those around them, but towards a vision of how to progress forward in life. Because at one level, although I've just said that Tsiolkas's novel map a sort of demise, a sort of weakening, unzipping of the rhetoric of multiculturalism, our realities, our everyday realities, have become super diverse, even more multicultural, not less. And so the need for a new kind of rhetoric or new kind of language, a new kind of philosophy, something to hope for, something to build with, is even more urgent for us. And similarly, I think the way in which identity politics has come to dominate our political discourse is something that Tsiolkas has been very skeptical, in fact scathing about, profoundly critical. In some of his non-fiction essays that you often find in The Age or The Saturday or in other magazines, you'll see him being very, very critical of the way in which identity politics is being mobilized on the left. Because in a way, he sees this as a conflict for the position of moral high ground, a competition for who can have moral superiority over others, but also a distraction from the real challenges and real material problems that people face in their everyday life. While we're all squabbling about, the correct terminology or arguing about how we should be addressed, etc., Tsiolkas points out that real terms economic inequalities have expanded. The world is becoming more polarized, not more connected. And in a sense, this moral debate is an opportunity, he sees, for the middle classes to parade their self-righteousness. And as Nick said in the introduction, as a consequence, Tsiolkas has walked away from many of the things that he claimed to have believed in at the beginning of his life and career. He was brought up as a Christian. He became a Marxist through his education and uni days. But now, as he says, he describes himself as an apostate, someone who has renounced his beliefs. Now, renouncing your beliefs and living another life is another thing. It's one thing to renounce, another thing to uphold and develop something else. There's a beautiful scene in David Malouf's novel Jono, which is about another figure who seeks to escape his restricted and constricted life in Australia. Jono says that he recognizes that every 7 years, the skin on your body has shed all its cells. Every 7 years, your body has replenished itself, literally on a cellular level. But the funny thing is, the scars that were there from childhood reproduce even though the cells have changed. And so in some ways we can renounce our beliefs, but some of the scars that are deeply ingrained in our psyche and our culture, in our habits, keep resurfacing. And so Tsiolkas is kind of bittersweet about his own recognition of the capacity to really move away from your previous belief systems, such as Marxism or Christianity. And in a sense, as much as he's tried to modulate or reflect or critically distance himself from a certain position, he's also very conscious of the risks of having nothing, leaving one system to go where, into what. He says that to renounce is not necessarily liberation, but a risk of losing all the handrails that support you, and a risk of falling in to a bottomless abyss. Let me quote a passage in it that he gave in an interview, where he's talking about his difficulty of renouncing his Christianity and being trapped in some kind of relationship with God, even though he sees himself as an agnostic and he's fighting with it, and wanting to hang on to some kind of idea of humanity, even as he's rejecting the old ideas of humanism. And he says, this is Christos, because when you lose faith, whether spiritual or political faith, or even faith in someone you love, it's literally falling off the cliff. You are in the air because you don't know where and how you are going to land. Because previously there was a safety net for everything, whether of ideology or of God or certainty. And those three novels, the novels prior to Barracuda, were all written in the act of falling. And it is out of falling that things emerge. What I was most fearful of doing was to be false, to provide an answer that I no longer had faith in myself. So this is the work of a person who's being honest with himself, who's confronting his own loss of belief. And Barracuda, I think, is the epitome of a character who, and this is the fourth path, because I'm going to zoom in from all this broad analysis and wide comparisons to a close reading of the novel Barracuda by Tsiolkas. Because in that novel, the character Dan, who I mentioned, was from a Greek mother, from an ethnic background, obviously, and a father who's Anglo, but from a working class background. Now, Dan neither feels pride in his ethnic roots nor solidarity with his father's class position, kind of aloof and detached from family networks and class politics. He seems to have no real belief system of any merit to uphold. He's the kind of person, as the old Marx would say, comfortable in his alienation. Why is he comfortable? Because, like I said, he had this superstar body. He was a champion swimmer, and he thought that that would elevate him into stardom in life. And through his body, he could achieve whatever he wanted to achieve. And for a while, it seemed to be taking him to all the high places. Being a champion swimmer certainly elevated him into the elite circles of Australian society. But being a person of dark appearance, he wasn't this blonde, blue-eyed boy because of his swarthy origins. He was also reminded of this existential racism and patronizing hierarchies that pervade Australian culture. So while Dan's body was all powerful, he could fight off all these slurs and barbs and put-downs and assert himself in that kind of macho way. And he had the hope that his body would take him all the way to being an Olympic champion. Unfortunately, that's where his body let him down. There was a decline, a crash, a vertical collapse. And suddenly, Dan is exposed to all the problems of the world without the strength of the body that he thought that he had, that could enable him to float above everything else that existed. And so when he goes back to his lover, who's this progressive girl from a middle-class background, or his university friends who seem to be embracing progressive politics, he looks at them all as if they're somewhere else. He looks at them as if they're speaking a language that has no connection to reality. He feels no trust or respect in any of their expressions. He feels like they're talking for the sake of talking, they're grandstanding, in other words. It's all rhetoric to him. And he doesn't have the intellectual capacity to break down their arguments or to take down their pontificating points. He just resents it and feels that they're hypocrites, but he can't even articulate it. And because he has no capacity to engage discursively, he uses his fists. He gets into fights, ends up in prison. While in prison, he reflects deeply about his own shortcomings and his own failures. Doesn't really have the capacity to build a theoretical or political or metaphysical solution, but he comes out of prison and decides that he must use the one thing that he has, which is the intuition of an athlete, the ability to connect with other people on a body-to-body level. And he discovers that he does have that talent, that he can work with handicapped people. He can work with the physically disabled. He can pick up signs in this non-linguistic body-to-body kind of way. And so if there is a story of redemption out of this journey from conflict and isolation, it is a redemption that occurs at a bodily level, at a sub-linguistic, sub-discursive, sub-political, sub-ideological level. The virtue that he discovers in these encounters is an interpersonal but bodily connection with others. It's not political. It's not even social. He sort of empties himself out into his relationship with others. And by emptying himself in this relationship, he kind of admits to a kind of cosmic liberation. There is a beautiful passage, which I'll now read, which describes this connection not only to others, but to the whole world. This is Dan saying, he imagines the ceaseless motion carrying him from one end to the other of this enormous island of infinite horizon. He draws the arc of the end of the world in his mind, sees the train hurtling off the tracks, leaping into the sun, diving and plummeting into the depths of the ocean. But the train has grown wings. Its arc is the pearl thread of moonlight banishing its shadows from the night. The train has spread wings, and it is soaring. This kind of cosmic encounter, this sort of illuminating force that we see in Barracuda, is very interesting in terms of what it is not expressing. It's not expressing any connection, any grounding back between this cosmic experience and some kind of ethnic identity, political class solidarity. Those bonds, those aggregating forces have been left aside. It's just a body with other bodies trying to commune with the infinite cosmos. So now, having spent a little bit of time looking at Tsiolkas' novel Barracuda in detail, I want to sort of compare him to a neoconservative philosopher in Germany, Peter Sloterdijk. It's going to be a little bit uncomfortable. I'm sure Tsiolkas probably wouldn't appreciate this, but I hope we can see the connections and possibly see some value in this in a minute. Now, Sloterdijk himself is an interesting character. He would not see himself as a right-wing person, but his work has been picked up by AfD. And one of his former students was a member of that alternative far right-wing party. And Sloterdijk himself was just kind of in the 60s and 70s, a hippie guy out there, went to India, came back to Germany, studied under Adorno, wrote these best-selling books on German philosophy. But in the last decade, he's been the most outspoken critic of immigration, of multiculturalism, and of the welfare system in Germany. And basically, he's seen and argues that the German system has capitulated to global forces and has abrogated its own responsibility to its national culture and identity, and that it's been hijacked by immigrants and lazy people who want to draw benefits from a welfare system. Now, what is the connection to Tsiolkas, you might say? Tsiolkas would never say anything like that, of course. But Tsiolkas also would agree with Sloterdijk to a degree, up to a point that is, about what has happened when our society has lost its foundations, when the national identity has been overtaken by globalizing forces. And he would agree with Sloterdijk's characterization that globalization has flattened the world, stripped it of any distinctive identity, and produced a kind of hollow, empty American mall kind of experience. And so while Tsiolkas would never go all the way with Sloterdijk in terms of his critique of immigration policies and multiculturalism, they both share a deep melancholy, a deep sense that there is a sense of anxiety and incompleteness in our life, and that the old certitudes are not going to carry us forward. The old certitudes have lost their urgency and power to convince and persuade people, and no one is prepared to fight for an old ideology anymore, let alone die for it. And so what we have instead is a kind of globalizing world where everyone is left adrift, where there is a kind of sense that all the distinctive markers of life have been broken or faded down, and that we live in a kind of mall with no atmosphere. It's all air conditioning, but no energy. Now, I'm going to be moving towards the sixth and final part of this lecture. This is my concluding point. Another scholar who makes similar criticisms of multiculturalism is the Slovenian cultural theorist and political activist Slavoj Žižek. He also has been skeptical of multiculturalism and criticized it and saying things like, well, what is multiculturalism but a distraction of political conflict? What is multiculturalism but a sort of weakening of our ability to produce solidarity in our society? What is multiculturalism? Another thing but an opportunity for American globalism to take over our cultural specificities and cultural identity. So in that sense, Zizek and Sloterdijk are speaking to a malaise that's occurred in progressive politics, a weakening, and a fantasy that things could be better if we just try again. But in fact, Zizek is more skeptical. And he's condemned the left for their narcissism, for their insistence on their own self-beliefs. And he says, that's not being courageous, hanging on to old ideas. That's not where truth lives and can be lead us anymore. We need to defy and break away from those old ideas, he says. To be courageous, he says, is to accept, he says, that there are no alternatives anymore. And to stop parading this illusion that the left is somehow superior to the right. This is Zizek's point, that true courage, and I quote, is not to imagine an alternative, but to accept the consequence of the fact that no discernible alternative exists. Stop imagining alternatives. Stop presuming that your left ideology can lead you to a better place, that the revolution is just around the corner, that something better can come from where you've started from. Now, there is the kind of honesty that I appreciate here in Zizek's work. He's saying that we need to resign ourselves to the facts on the ground. We need to look at the situation as it is, to stop fantasizing about ideal scenarios in the future based on old principles and old values. But in a sense, this use of the word courage is rather reductionist. And I was jolted into another way of thinking about this scenario when I read an Italian philosopher called Giorgio Agamben, who said, thought is the courage of hopelessness. The courage of hopelessness. What does Agamben mean by that exquisite phrase, the courage of hopelessness? He's saying that when we're in a situation where we have no handrails, when we're in a situation where the direction forward is not obvious, when we're thinking that all the maps that we had are no longer valid, the courageous response is not to be pragmatic, as Zizek put it, but rather to allow thought to kick in. Thought is imagining. So it's imagining, thinking kicks in exactly when all the infrastructure that held thought together in the past has fallen apart. That's when thought is at its most powerful. So in a sense, it's at that point when you're falling, as Christos put it, that thinking starts to kick in, even when you've lost faith in the very maps, handrails, and paths that you had before you. So let's think about this scenarios that, and I'll recap for a second, the scenarios that Christos has mapped before us. The scenarios of this erosion of class values, the scenarios where cultural politics has often been distracted by identity politics and moral debates around self-righteousness, a scenario where the true victims of society are experiencing even more injustice and greater inequality than ever before, and a scenario where our rhetoric and their realities are getting further and further apart. The disconnect between the language of justice and the experience of injustice is now more profound than ever. So what do we do in this situation? How do we make our way forward in this scenario? How do we resurrect a moral universe when the old morality has collapsed? What was it that Nietzsche said? God is dead. Does that mean that morality is finished? Or does that mean there's a duty to reinvent a new ethical relationship to the world? Now, I believe it's important, as Zizek has told us, to be skeptical, to be pragmatic, to face the realities as they are, and not to go into fantasy. But, as Agamben also points out, when the situation is truly hopeless, that's when thought has to kick in the most. So it's not enough to be skeptical, to expose the hypocrisy, to unzip the certitudes of the well-meaning or the detached or the self-righteous. That is a cheap shot. That is a useful countermeasure, a corrective, etc., etc. But we need to go more than aware of our own disillusionment or our own disenchantment with the world. We need to become more conscious of the possibilities of doing something differently in this world. Now, maybe this is a bit harsh, but I think Tsiolkas' novels also reflect a trajectory which has taken an author away from his or her community. Community, I don't mean the Greek community or even a writer's community. I mean the local. What is the local's life world like in the world we're living in now? What is the life world that produces protest, that produces anguish, that produces hope and desire in this world today? I said that the discourse of multiculturalism is seeming weaker and weaker than ever before, and yet the reality is super diverse, more multicultural than ever before. And therefore, the pressure of us is to go to the minute, to the detail, to the local in a new way, and to see how people are in fact creating bonds, creating connections, creating hope amongst each other, sometimes body to body, sometimes just by the way they look each other in the eye, sometimes in the little micro exchanges of mistranslated words, sometimes in the way in which they do things like share a garden, sometimes in the ways in which they then band together to do and to produce a new service, a new kind of way of keeping people like the Sikhs are in their delivery of supplies in this COVID world. So we see an inventiveness, a resilience, a hopefulness at the local level, which is not yet finding its own voice, let alone a voice from great authors of our generation. And in a sense, the only way out of nihilism, I see, is not with another meta-narrative, a grand narrative that goes over and above everything around us. Not this sort of bird's eye view of the world, but something that zooms into the local and through that also loops out to the cosmic. So I think we can find a breathing space that is a critique of capital, not in the way in which neoconservatives like Sloterdijk want to resurrect the integrity of the German people against globalizing forces and invading immigrant armies and lazy parasites in the welfare system. That is no solution. However, I do believe that if we think more carefully about how our everyday realities can produce new bonds and connections with other people, then yes, we can produce a cosmopolitanism, and we can discover the cosmopolitanism that's already there in our lives. So with those words, I want to thank you and hand it back to Nick to field questions.
Thank you, Nico, for a fascinating presentation. As I wouldn't have expected sort of any less. A lot to sort of think about with your commentary. Just waiting for the questions to come in. Might just start with a comment on Zizek's work. As insightful as his comments and analysis might be, doesn't it become a bit hollow if you're not able to offer some type of alternative or way forward?
Do you think what Zizek proposes is ultimately hollow? Is that your point, Nick?
Yeah, well, anyone can be a critic from a distance and analyze things and make commentary, but to really start respecting someone, you really have to sort of offer path forward, offer alternative solutions, and to give people hope.
I agree with you. I think Zizek is a good pricker of balloons. He's got a fantastic eye on of seeing where there's hype and where there is hyperbole and where there is narcissism and fake ideas. But I don't think he has any consciousness of lived experiences of multiculturalism. And so he grew up and worked and spends a lot of his time in Ljubljana in Slovenia, which is the most monocultural part of former Yugoslavia. And so if that's his prototype, I mean, he's got no consciousness of the very thing that he's attacking. And so this is part of the problem with these sort of critics who look at things from a distance, dismiss them without any practical experience, without any kind of close observation of those who have lived it and recorded it or reported on it, and just a willingness to sort of take the grand standing position and dismiss it out hand. So I agree that in a sense, I can see that Zizek is very good at having a go at the small L liberals, having a go at the social democrats who were very pious and self-righteous, and having a go at those old Stalinists who lost any connection with reality as well. So he's having a go at that wide spectrum of the left in the center, right? But as you say, what he's effectively only doing is saying, okay, let's wake up to where capitalism has taken us and build something from there. And I say that pragmatism is valuable. That kind of reality checking is valuable. But that doesn't mean you stop imagining. And that's Agamben's point. Imagining, in fact, is at its most valuable when you have, in fact, lost all the certitudes. And you have lost, and that's all the foundations upon which your previous values were built on. So pragmatism, yes, but not enough.
Do you believe that both philosophers are sort of European-based might be a disadvantage because they're probably experiences, like their living experience of multiculturalism probably hasn't been the sort of, let's say, positive with regards to the experience of multiculturalism, let's say in Australia or Canada. Not that things are perfect here, but I think the fact that they're both European-based might have sort of limited their scope in the, let's say, the possibilities of multiculturalism. So
the problem I have with European debates about multiculturalism is that they were never from the ground up. In Australia, more or less, multiculturalism came from the ground up. It wasn't invented by good bureaucrats, and it wasn't invented by ethnic elites. Now, there were important members of our Greek community like George Papadopoulos and Spiro Moreidis, who were doctors and lawyers, right? But you wouldn't have called them an elite, right? They were successful in our community, and they led a lot of the multicultural debates, but they didn't invent it entirely either. So they were quite dependent upon the groundswell forces that came literally from the ground up, from people's visceral experiences, from their profound sense of injustice, from their deep sense of wanting to get something back from the society that they had so much contributed to, wanting to create something new in a new country that they had come to. That groundswell force that is both creative and indignant. It's angry at the society that excluded them, but also desirous and wanting to make something new. That energy I've never seen coming up from the ground in Europe. That has been suppressed for a number of reasons. First, because multiculturalism came quite late, and by then it was already a sophisticated policy in places like Canada, Australia, and to a less extent in the United States. And so, in a sense, it was imported from one bureaucrat to another. So it was seen as a policy solution to a social problem which they had turned their blind eye to, but they never got any sense of a connection to the people who were supposedly was for. And then the people who became advocates of multiculturalism were quite different to the ones that we see in Australia. There's a big class divide and an almost feudal divide between some folks who are of different ethnic communities in Europe. Many of the advocates of multicultural positions and leaders in Britain, for instance, were feudal landlords in their home countries in Pakistan and India. Their problem was that they weren't recognized as equivalent to the elites in Oxford and Cambridge, where they studied with other elites. And so often they used multiculturalism as a way of getting revenge and also opening up opportunities in this more limited way. Now, this is a bit harsh, I agree, and I'm being a bit simplistic. But the basic point that I want to make, the basic and fundamental distinction I want to make between the way in which multiculturalism emerged in Australia and the way in which it's developed and implemented in Europe is that in Australia it was more or less ground up. In Europe, and Britain in particular, it was very much bureaucratic-led and top-down.
Okay, thanks for your comments. We've got a question from Andonis Miras. In regards to Christos's beliefs, in the end, did he ever confide in anyone where his beliefs lied eventually?
Oh, he confides openly that one of the great things about Christos's work is that he's very transparent. He doesn't hide his feelings. He's very direct and honest and upfront about them. The quote that I read was in an interview with other people. So, I think there is a disenchantment with Marxism and a constant struggle with Christianity that repeats itself throughout Christos's work. Now, what I'm also saying is that it's one thing to renounce it. It's another thing to completely shed yourself of it altogether. So there's residual tensions that keep reproducing, scars that keep repeating in the body of his writing and thinking. And so his feelings towards Christianity are very mixed. On the one hand, he sees how repressive and divisive it is as an institution. On the other hand, he sees it as an archive of love and divine connection and genuine solid opportunity for building community. So this conflict is played out constantly in his work. So there's never a sense that he's completely erased it or dismissed it altogether. Same with Marxism. I don't think he, as much as he's critical of the left, that he thinks that everything Marx said was stupid by any means. There are so many incredibly powerful and resonant ideas to this that are still valuable to this day in Marx's work. So I think that tension between the institutionalization of the church and party and the depth of the archives from which these institutions are drawn, whether it's Christian texts or philosophical ideas, there is this conflict that's been constantly played out in his work.
This is more a comment, Nico, from Tammy Leo. I couldn't help but link your thoughts with what we are experiencing here in Melbourne at the moment. What we are seeing with the far right.
I can't hear you, Nick.
Sorry.
Yeah,
this is a comment. Can you hear me now?
Nico, I've lost you.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now, Nico?
I still can't hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Nick, I've completely You're gone silent.
Okay. Not sure what to say, Nico. My microphone is on. Can you hear me now? Costa, can you help us here, or can I have an indication from the audience that they can still hear me? Nico, can you hear me now or no?
I didn't hear anything then. Am I on now?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me now?
Can you type the question at least for me?
Yeah, they're in the private chat, Nick. They're in the private chat, in the chat.
Nick, can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly.
I can't hear you though.
Okay. Costa, what's the fallback position here? Nico, can you read the questions in the chat, please? Okay. Just one, we've got a bit of a problem here.
Do you want me to leave and come back?
Just leave and come back. Just leave and come back. Yeah. Sorry, everyone. We just Nico's just going to disconnect and just reconnect. Seem to be having.
I can hear you now, Nick.
Okay, good.
Sorry about that. You were I completely lost you.
All right. The old turn on and off trick, it seems to work. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Let's go. Okay, I'm just trying to bring the chat up again. It was more just a comment from Tammy Leo. I couldn't help but link your thoughts with what we're experiencing here in Melbourne at the moment, what we are seeing with the far right and COVID-related riots, and how leadership seems to be doing the bird's eye view. So it was just more a comment. Question from Jeffrey Conahan. Is Tsiolkas a nihilist or an iconoclast? I find his work ultimately seeking something beyond, but then I might just be naively optimistic.
That's a very good question about the difference between a nihilist and an iconoclast, and a person who also is seeking something else as well. I think there's elements of all three in Tsiolkas's work, and some of the characters just are falling into nihilism. Others, like Ari in Loaded, are directly trying to knock down the idols of our society and break through the barriers that repress and contain people. So there is definitely an iconoclastic and confrontational and oppositional energy that we find at the beginning of Tsiolkas's novel, and in a way remains all the way through his novels. The nihilistic dimensions become stronger and stronger, but the third element of this seeking something greater, seeking something more valuable, is also very real. And this is where I think it's quite interesting that the character Dan in Barracuda discovers a sense of virtue, which is, of course, interpersonal, but also cosmic. So therefore, there is a reaching towards the other and to the infinite. And that upholding of a belief that something bigger than yourself is fundamental to Tsiolkas's work. I don't think Tsiolkas's work is just about egocentric rights, to go back to Tammy's observations about what is going on right now today in terms of the demonstrations, because in my mind, that's the nihilism that is the worst kind of nihilism that we could fall into in our society, where people are just demanding the right to have the right to be selfish, irrespective of the right and obligation to be careful and dutiful towards others. Now, that conflict has to be always balanced. And what we see in the demonstrations today is a desire to be free of that need to balance things, and to insist on their own of their own rights independently of everybody else's. Now, that is not the position that you see emerging and developing and transpiring in Tsiolkas's work. What you do see is a search for something that has grace, even, but it also is a loss of faith in what had certitude in the past, what had direction and ideological foundation and destination in the past. So the risk, of course, is that you end up falling into that abyss, and that's where the balancing between the iconoclast, the searcher, and the nihilist is constant in Tsiolkas's work, and that's one of its great qualities, is that those tensions are not resolved; they're just played out.
Question from Vasilis Tsamis. Should this new thinking with imagination take place at the artistic level first and then transpose itself into the cultural and political level? If so, is this Christos's call to arms of all artists?
No, I don't think there's a hierarchy, and I don't think that artists have a leadership role. I think that these things happen simultaneously and they coexist. The political, the social, the artistic, they're all in a kind of, in a jungle, let's say, in a forest of signs that are circulating with each other. So rather than seeing that as a sort of vertical hierarchy, I see it more like a sort of being in the field where there's an interplay between each other. And so that we're all learning from each other. And sometimes, you know, there are things to learn from the people around you who you'd least expect to learn from. This metaphor of jungle, you know, that I'm using is coming from Levi-Strauss, who of course is the great anthropologist who did his field work in Brazil and observed the intelligence of the so-called savage mind. But on his way to Brazil, he had a long boat ride to go from Paris to Rio de Janeiro. And he wrote a very beautiful book about the journey out there called Tristes Tropiques. And one of the great points that he makes in the book is that it's surprising how you find yourself enjoying the company of people you least expected. And he describes how he got on with someone who was a postman or something. I can't remember exactly the occupation, but his point was that the person he learned more from wasn't the other intellectuals on the boat, but a person from a so-called lowly trade.
Thank you for that. For a question here from George Messinas, as cosmopolitan, are we running the risk of becoming a homogenized identity where we give up on the courage to be disliked and denying diversity?
Cosmopolitanism is not globalization. The cosmos in cosmopolitanism is not the same as the global in globalization. So globalization works towards the standardization of the world. And by standardization, it presupposes that the world can be broken down into units that are commensurable, tradable, measurable, and interchangeable. Those units end us in the mall. And yes, that is the homogenization of the world. That's what globalization works toward, when it presupposes that the world can be broken down into discrete units that are interchangeable in that kind of standardized way. Cosmopolitanism has got nothing to do with that. Cosmopolitanism isn't closing down the world or breaking it down into small parts. Cosmopolitanism is an openness, a curiosity, an empathy, a compassion, a creativity towards the other. So while globalization is working towards standardization and homogenization, cosmopolitanism has the opposite trajectory, the opposite orientation. It's working towards differentiation, being open, being diverse, being different all the time. And so the process, the orientation of cosmopolitanism is in fact towards constant change, heterogenization, not homogenization.
Okay, thanks, Nico. And I think by that reply, you also probably answered Cassie's question. Question from Olivia Boyages. Thank you for a fascinating presentation. Do you interpret Tsiolkas' work as a criticism of ideological rhetoric and discourse, generally as irrelevant, or an attempt to demonstrate its potential to exclude but still relevant?
The question of relevance is very interesting, the way that's been phrased by Olivia. There's definitely a critique of ideology, and I think the critique in terms of relevance is that that ideology is developed in a way that it exists in a bubble, and increasingly that bubble is less and less connected to the reality from which it's come from. So in a sense, it's less relevant to the real world, even though it's speaking for or to that world. Now, in by speaking for and to the world, it's separating itself from that world. Now, it could still keep some channels of communication between them, but what I think Tsiolkas is observing is the loss of those channels that are keeping it vitally connected with each other. And those loss of channels have produced a hierarchy of exclusion and self-assuredness and smugness and self-rewarding ideology, and as a consequence, a sense of resentment and frustration and bitterness or detachment from the others who feel like, sure, there's political discourse, but we'll live our lives independently and separately. So as a consequence, we probably have, you're familiar with lots of people who seem to be indifferent to the mainstream in our society, oblivious to what is going on the main channels in our media, because they are existing in their own little private bubbles, which connect themselves to other people in Buenos Aires or in Johannesburg or in Toronto. And so they operate in these little spheres, which are connected with other parts of the world, but are almost immune to the realities in their own neighborhoods. So this tension, this separation and this fragmentation that is occurring in our society through these new networks of communication is having profound consequences on the capacity for any society to be able to cohere and to coordinate and to come together in any meaningful way. So I think, in a sense, Tsiolkas's work is a symptom, is an indication, a measure of these tensions that are existing in our society.
Nico, I think that's all we have with respect to questions at the moment. Thank you again for another insightful presentation. That seminar drink might have to happen post-lockdown. Thanks once again. It's an honor to have you, and you're always welcome back here. And just a reminder to those following us, feel free to join us next week where we have Professor Christos Tsiolkas, one of Greece's preeminent historians, to speak on the global resonance of the 1821 Greek War of Independence. Nico, thanks once again. Best of luck with your research, and hope to have you back again in the near future.
My pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity, Nick.